The summer sky above the desert was Daniel Brooks's refuge. The heavy thump of the old helicopter blades was his armor, and Atlas, his German shepherd, usually slept through every mile of burning sand below, until today. Without warning, the dog went rigid. A low, urgent whine slipped from his chest as he pressed his nose hard against the glass. He wasn't looking at the horizon. He wasn't watching the mountains. He was staring straight down at an endless stretch of scorched desert. Daniel almost snapped at him, irritated that the ritual had been broken. The sky was where the past stayed quiet. But then he saw it. 3 letters carved deep into the sand. SOS, uneven, desperate, written by hands that were running out of strength. Near the letters lay a woman, motionless beneath the brutal sun, her shadow thin, her body still, in a place where no one was supposed to last long enough to ask for help. In that moment, the silence inside Daniel shifted. He had a choice. Keep flying and protect the peace he had fought so hard to build, or descend into the heat, into the unknown, and risk waking the ghosts he had sworn were buried forever. Some believe God only speaks through thunder. Others know he whispers, through a loyal dog who refuses to look away, through a message scratched into sand, through the pull to save a stranger you were never meant to meet. If you believe God still answers quiet prayers, comment Amen below, and follow the channel for more stories of faith, courage, and second chances. Heat shimmered over Nevada's desert like a living mirage, and the sky hung pale and relentless, wide enough to swallow secrets, bright enough to expose them. Daniel Brooks flew anyway. He always did, 3 times a week, as if routine could be stitched into armor. At 45, he carried the kind of strength that never came from a gym mirror. Rope-hauling forearms, hands scored with small scars, shoulders set by years of practical strain. His face was angular and weather-cut, the cheekbones sharp beneath sun-darkened skin, the jaw shaded by a stubborn stubble that looked less like style and more like habit, an old survival reflex from places where a razor was a luxury and a clean chin meant nothing. His hair, dark brown with threads of silver, stayed cropped short enough to behave under a headset, yet still insisted on curling at the edges as if it refused to be fully disciplined. The most noticeable thing, though, were his eyes. A muted steel gray that didn't sparkle, didn't plead, didn't soften easily. They scanned the horizon the way a man scans a room after learning too young that danger doesn't announce itself. People sometimes mistook that look for coldness. Daniel knew it was simply the shape grief took when it decided it would rather stand than collapse. He lived alone near the desert's edge, far from the tourist roads and the neon jokes of the highway. His small rented place sat behind a line of scrub and sun-bleached fencing, the kind of home that didn't invite visitors because it didn't have anything to show them except silence. Silence was what Daniel paid for. Silence was what he defended. After leaving the Navy, he had walked away from crowds the way a man steps away from a fire he can no longer feel, but still fears will scorch him if he gets too close. People in town knew him as the helicopter guy, polite, distant, the kind who nodded hello but didn't linger long enough to collect questions. He bought supplies at off hours. He paid in full. He didn't flirt. He didn't argue. He didn't offer stories. And if anyone tried to ask about the past, Daniel's face tightened in a way that made even the boldest talkers suddenly remember they had somewhere else to be. It wasn't rudeness, it was boundary lines drawn with quiet precision. He'd spent too long learning what happens when boundaries fail. The helicopter was older than some of the people who gossiped about it, a UH-1 Huey, a veteran machine with an exhausted dignity. Its metal skin faded from sun and time, its seams carrying the scars of countless repairs. Daniel had found it years earlier in a state that looked like it had been abandoned by hope itself. Weathered panels, thirsty wires, an engine that coughed like an old man waking up angry. He rebuilt it piece by piece with the patience of someone who didn't trust quick miracles. The work had given his hands a job when his mind wanted to sabotage him. When Daniel was elbow-deep in grease, tightening a bolt or coaxing life into a stubborn system, the ghosts couldn't get a word in. Machines made sense. Machines obeyed physics. Machines didn't ask why a man woke sweating, heart-hammering, convinced he'd heard a voice on the other side of the room, only to find nothing but the moonlight and the quiet hum of his own blood. In the helicopter, with the rotors biting the air, Daniel found the closest thing he had to peace. Not happiness, not warmth, but a controlled emptiness. Sound became a wall. Vibration became a shield. Altitude became distance from everything on the ground that might try to pull him back into being a person with a name and expectations. Up here he could be only a pilot and a pulse, a man and a machine negotiating gravity. And beside him, always beside him, was Atlas. Atlas was a 6-year-old German shepherd with a coat like storm clouds. Charcoal black along the spine, shifting into steel gray over the ribs and shoulders, the kind of coloring that made him look carved out of dusk. He weighed close to 90 pounds, built for endurance rather than bulk, muscles long and sinewed under dense fur. His ears sat high and alert, twin triangles that seemed to listen even when he slept, and his eyes, amber, intelligent, unsettlingly aware, could turn a room quiet without a bark. Atlas didn't do tricks for strangers. He didn't fetch tennis balls with joyful stupidity. He didn't offer the easy friendliness people expected from dogs they wanted to pet and photograph. His loyalty was precise, an exclusive currency. With Daniel, he was steady and calm, but always watchful, as if he understood that the man he guarded wasn't only threatened by what existed outside. Daniel had gotten Atlas from a retired K-9 handler who spoke of him with the respect reserved for soldiers. Smart enough to read grief, stubborn enough to ignore treats when something felt wrong, brave enough to plant himself between danger and the people he'd chosen. Daniel didn't train Atlas so much as he learned to live beside him. They had met at a point when Daniel's life felt like a corridor with no doors, and the dog had walked in like a quiet oath. You may not want company, but you still need a witness. The first night Atlas slept in Daniel's home, he had paced every corner, sniffed every shadow, and only settled when he was sure the place held no immediate threats. Daniel, watching from the couch with a glass of water he forgot to drink, had felt something unfamiliar loosen in his chest. Not safety. He didn't trust safety, but the faint recognition of being protected. It was a strange, almost humorous reversal. The former Navy special warfare operator, the man others imagined as indestructible, quietly relieved to have a dog deciding the perimeter. Daniel never said it out loud, but the truth lived in the way his hand sometimes rested on Atlas's neck when the night got too sharp. Atlas was the only creature Daniel allowed close enough to hear the parts of him that still screamed. The ritual began the same way every flight day began. Before sunrise had fully burned the cool out of the air, Daniel drove to the small hangar strip on the desert's edge, where the heat hadn't yet grown teeth. He moved with methodical calm, checking fuel lines, testing the throttle, listening to the engine's tone like a doctor listening to a heartbeat. He ran his palm along the helicopter's body, feeling the vibration before it happened, respecting the machine's age like one respects an old warrior's joints. Atlas followed, quiet as a shadow, nails clicking softly on the concrete, nose working the air, reading messages Daniel couldn't. Daniel strapped him in beside the co-pilot seat with a harness built for this purpose, clipped and double-checked not because Atlas was reckless, but because Daniel couldn't tolerate the idea of losing the one constant in his orbit to something as stupid as turbulence. He wore his headset, adjusted the mic, and when the engine finally caught, the familiar thunder rolled through the cabin and into his bones. It was a sound that drowned thought. That was the point. The blades began to turn, slow at first, then faster, until the air itself seemed to tremble in obedience. Dust lifted in a halo around them. The desert, which had been still and silent, suddenly looked like it was breathing. Daniel lifted off, the helicopter rising with a steady pull that felt like being unpinned from the world. Below, the sand stretched out in pale gold waves, ridges and dunes like the backs of sleeping beasts. Farther out, Dark rock formations cut through the brightness like teeth. The road lines disappeared. The town shrank into something that couldn't reach him, and in that moment, Daniel's shoulders dropped a fraction barely noticeable, but real. Up here, he could pretend he was only a man who loved flying. He could pretend the sky was a sanctuary and not a hiding place. He could let the noise fill his skull until there was no room for anything else. It worked most days. Most days, Atlas would curl into his seat and sleep, his breathing steady, the occasional soft snore vibrating through the headset's low hum. Daniel would smirk at that, an involuntary little crack in his seriousness. He didn't laugh often, but Atlas's shameless peace had a way of making humor sneak up on him. "Must be nice," Daniel would sometimes mutter, as if the dog could understand the sarcasm. And Atlas, eyes half-lidded, would blink once in slow agreement, the way a creature might respond to a complaint it considered unnecessary. Daniel talked to Atlas more than he talked to people. Words felt safer with the dog. Dogs didn't repeat them later. Dogs didn't twist them into pity. Today, Daniel guided the helicopter along his fixed route, an invisible line only he knew, a loop that traced the desert's edge and returned him home before afternoon heat became too violent. He kept altitude steady, not high enough to disappear into clouds, not low enough to invite trouble. The sky was clean and harsh, a perfect blue that felt almost indecent in its cheerfulness. Sunlight hit the windshield and flashed back at him. Daniel lowered his sunglasses, though the glare wasn't what bothered him. What bothered him was the quiet inside the quiet, the brief gaps between the rotor thunder where memory tried to slide in like a knife. A flicker of images surfaced, sand in his teeth, radio static, a voice calling his name, then stopping. The kind of stopping that rewires a man. Daniel tightened his grip on the controls until his knuckles paled. He swallowed, forcing the thought back down. Not now, not up here, not during the ritual. The ritual was sacred, not because it was beautiful, but because it worked. It kept him functional, it kept him breathing, it kept him from becoming the kind of man who drank himself into oblivion or tried to outrun nightmares with worse decisions. Daniel had seen too many veterans lose that war. He refused to be another statistic. So he flew. He flew the way other people prayed. Atlas lay with his head tucked, eyes closed. The dog's body was warm against the seat, a steady presence amid the machine's vibration. Daniel glanced at him, and a faint softness moved behind his ribs. Atlas was more than a companion. Atlas was proof that Daniel could still keep something alive, that he could still be trusted with responsibility, that he could still, in some small way, be a protector rather than a destroyer. Daniel had once been trained to break doors, to clear rooms, to make choices that left no room for regret until later. Those skills hadn't vanished. They had simply gone quiet, like an old weapon locked in a drawer. He told himself he was done with missions, done with chaos, done with being the guy people called when everything went wrong. Yet the sky had a way of reminding him, a man doesn't bury who he was. He only builds new habits over the grave and hopes they hold. As the helicopter cut across the desert, Daniel felt the familiar lull settle in, a trance of sound and motion. The rotors beat time. The horizon held steady. The world below became a map, not a place. Daniel's mind eased into that controlled emptiness he craved. He breathed. For a brief stretch he was simply present, simply here, simply alive. He could almost imagine he might land later, make coffee, sit on the porch of his quiet home, and let the day pass without the past tugging at his sleeve. He could almost believe the sky was enough to keep him whole. Atlas's snore deepened, low and ridiculous. Daniel's mouth twitched. "You're the only one who can sleep through war drums," he murmured, and for once the words carried something like affection without pain attached. The helicopter's shadow slid across the dunes like a dark ship sailing a golden sea of sand. Except Daniel didn't call it a sea. He refused that word. Seas had taken enough. This was desert. This was dust. This was the kind of place that looked empty until it wasn't. Daniel didn't know yet that today the ritual would break. He didn't know that the sky, his refuge, was about to demand a choice. For now, he kept flying, and the sound kept the ghosts at bay, and Atlas slept like a creature that still believed the world could be simple. Daniel let himself borrow that belief for a few heartbeats longer, following his invisible route across the blazing desert as if nothing down there could reach him. The desert at noon looked unreal, a vast sheet of pale gold vibrating under heat so intense it seemed to bend the air itself, and Daniel Brooks felt the familiar pressure behind his eyes as the helicopter pushed forward, blades chopping through hot silence with stubborn rhythm. He had settled into the narrow corridor of calm he depended on, that thin place where the past stayed muted and the present obeyed rules, altitude steady, speed constant, horizon flat and predictable. Atlas lay beside him, harness snug, body stretched along the seat with the loose confidence of a creature that trusted the routine. For several long minutes, nothing existed beyond vibration and light. Then Atlas moved. It was not the lazy shift of a dog resettling or the twitch of a dream. His entire body locked as if a wire had been pulled tight beneath his skin. His ears snapped forward, rigid, and a low sound rolled out of his chest. Not a bark, not fear, but warning. Daniel felt it before he registered it, a small spike of irritation cutting through the calm. The ritual wasn't supposed to break. The ritual was the agreement he had made with himself and the sky. Fly, keep moving, don't look down too long, don't let anything on the ground ask questions. Easy, Daniel muttered into the mic, more reflex than intention, reaching one hand toward the control panel to steady the aircraft as Atlas leaned forward. The dog pressed his nose hard against the glass, breath fogging a small circle on the windshield despite the heat, eyes fixed with unsettling intensity. He wasn't tracking birds or shadows. He wasn't reacting to sound. He was staring straight down. Daniel's jaw tightened. He almost snapped, almost told the dog to lie down and stop disrupting the only peace Daniel had left. But Atlas did not look away. His amber eyes were locked, his body angled toward something only he seemed to understand. Daniel had learned over years of quiet coexistence that Atlas did nothing without reason. That knowledge, unwanted and intrusive, crept in like a hand on Daniel's shoulder. With a sigh that tasted of annoyance and something closer to dread, Daniel eased the collective, lowering altitude just enough to see more clearly. At first, the desert offered nothing new rolling sand, heat shimmer, scattered scrub clinging stubbornly to life. Then, as the helicopter slid forward, the pattern changed. 3 shapes resolved themselves against the pale ground. Not rocks, not shadows. Letters. Big, uneven, unmistakable. SOS. Written directly into the sand, carved deep enough to fight the wind. The lines jagged and irregular, the strokes dragging in places as if whoever wrote them had fallen, gotten back up, and kept going anyway. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, the sound swallowed by the engine. He stared, disbelief pressing hard against recognition. You didn't see things like that out here by accident. You didn't write SOS in the middle of nowhere unless you were already losing the argument with the sun. Atlas let out another low whine, more urgent now, and shifted his weight as if preparing to move despite the harness. Daniel felt the silence inside him shift, the way it always did before something irreversible happened. He circled once, heart beginning to thud in a rhythm that had nothing to do with flight. On the second pass, he saw her. She lay just beyond the last letter, half turned on her side, one arm stretched toward the sand, as if she'd tried to pull herself forward after finishing the message. She was small against the desert, her body a dark interruption in all that light. Daniel dropped lower, squinting through glare. A woman, adult, alone. Her clothing was dust-coated and torn at the seams, the colors muted by sand and sweat. She wasn't moving. Atlas growled softly, a sound Daniel recognized as protective rather than aggressive, and began to tremble with contained energy. Daniel felt irritation drain out of him, replaced by something heavier and colder. This was not a curiosity. This was a decision. He hovered, mind racing through calculations, Fuel, distance to the nearest road, radio range, the helicopter's limits in this heat. The rational part of him offered excuses quickly, efficiently. You can mark the coordinates. You can call it in. You don't need to land. That part sounded reasonable. It always did. Another part, older and far less patient, pushed back with the memory of a voice that had gone quiet over a radio years ago. Daniel swallowed. He angled the helicopter downward, slow and controlled, the blades kicking sand into a violent spiral as the aircraft descended. Heat rushed up to meet them, brutal and immediate, the smell of dust and scorched earth flooding the cabin. Atlas braced himself instinctively, muscles taut, eyes never leaving the figure on the ground. The helicopter settled with a jarring thump, skids biting into sand that threatened to give way. Daniel killed the throttle, and the sudden absence of noise felt wrong, too loud in its own way. The desert rushed back in wind hissing, sand skittering, the sun bearing down like an accusation. Daniel pulled off his headset and unbuckled, movements efficient despite the tightness in his chest. "Stay," he told Atlas automatically, though the dog was already straining forward, nails scraping lightly against the floor. Daniel opened the door, and the heat slammed into him, stealing his breath for a second as he climbed down onto the sand. It burned through his boots, radiating upward, and he understood immediately how lethal this place could be to a body already pushed past its limits. He jogged toward the woman, boots sinking, heart pounding harder with each step. Up close, she looked worse. Her skin was sunburned deep red across her face and forearms, peeling in places, lips cracked and swollen. Her hair, dark brown, almost black, was tangled and stiff with sweat, cut unevenly as if it had been pulled back and torn loose. She looked to be in her early 30s, slim to the point of fragility now, though Daniel could see signs of strength beneath the exhaustion. Defined shoulders, forearms marked by old calluses rather than softness. This wasn't someone who had wandered out here unprepared. He knelt, ignoring the heat biting through his pants, and checked her pulse. It was there, faint but steady enough to give him a sliver of hope. Her chest rose shallowly. She was alive. Atlas was suddenly beside him, having ignored the stay command with unapologetic loyalty. The dog stood over the woman's head, body angled protectively, scanning the horizon while lowering his nose close enough to sniff her breath. He didn't bark. He didn't snap. He simply placed himself between her and the empty desert, as if the space itself were a threat. Daniel felt something twist inside him at that, an unexpected ache that had nothing to do with old injuries. "Okay," Daniel murmured, more to himself than the dog, voice rough. "Okay." He lifted the woman carefully, surprised by how light she felt, and carried her back toward the helicopter, Atlas pacing at his side like an escort. Inside the cabin, Daniel laid her across the rear seat, propping her head with a folded jacket, hands moving automatically through an assessment he hadn't used in years. He found a cracked canteen in her pack and dribbled a few drops of water onto her lips, careful not to shock her system. Atlas settled on the floor near her feet, eyes alert, ears flicking at every sound. As if summoned by the touch, the woman stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, lashes coated with dust, and a dry sound escaped her throat. Daniel leaned closer. "Hey," he said, keeping his tone calm, grounded. "You're safe. You hear me?" Her eyes opened briefly, unfocused, revealing a dull hazel that sharpened for a second as she tried to make sense of the world. Her gaze flicked to Atlas, then back to Daniel, confusion and something like relief passing over her face. Her mouth moved again, words scraping out like gravel. "I wrote it," she whispered, voice shredded. Daniel nodded. "I know. You did good." That seemed to anchor her. She swallowed with visible effort. "Did it work?" A humorless breath escaped Daniel's nose. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It worked." Her eyes closed again, exhaustion pulling her under, but her breathing evened out slightly, and Daniel felt the tension in his shoulders ease by a fraction. He strapped her in, adjusting the belt gently, and turned back toward the cockpit. As he restarted the helicopter, the engine's roar filled the cabin once more, but it didn't feel like a wall now. It felt like a responsibility. Atlas remained where he was, chin on his paws, gaze fixed on the woman as if committing her presence to memory. Daniel lifted off slowly, the desert falling away beneath them, the SOS shrinking until it was just a scar in the sand. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know how she'd ended up there or what waited beyond this moment. But he knew one thing with absolute clarity. The ritual was broken, and there would be no pretending otherwise. As the helicopter climbed, Daniel glanced once more at Atlas. The dog met his eyes and blinked, calm and steady, as if to say this was always going to happen. Daniel exhaled, a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and turned the nose of the aircraft toward the distant line of mountains, carrying with him the weight of a choice already made. The helicopter descended into the desert like a heavy thought, refusing to be ignored, its blades slicing the air and hurling sand outward in violent arcs as Daniel Brooks brought the aircraft down with deliberate care. The heat surged upward the moment the skids kissed the ground, not merely warm, but punishing, a physical force that wrapped around his legs and chest as if the desert itself were testing his resolve. The engine's roar faded, replaced by a raw, oppressive silence broken only by wind scraping grains of sand across metal. Daniel paused for half a second with his hands still on the controls, eyes forward, feeling the weight of what he had just chosen settle into his bones. This was no longer observation. This was involvement. He pulled off his headset and stepped out, boots sinking slightly as the sand gave under his weight, each step radiating heat straight through the soles. Nearby, the 3 carved letters SOS lay scarred into the desert floor, their edges softening already as the wind tried to erase them. Just beyond them lay the woman, unmoving. Atlas was out of the helicopter before Daniel finished his second step, the German shepherd landing lightly and immediately placing himself between the woman and the open desert, body angled into the wind. Up close, Atlas looked even more formidable, thick fur rippling along his shoulders, muscles taut beneath, ears pinned forward as he scanned the horizon. His posture was not frantic. It was measured, professional, the stance of a guardian who had already decided what mattered. Daniel knelt beside the woman, ignoring the heat biting through his pants. She lay on her side, one arm stretched toward the final curve of the S, fingers stiff, nails rimmed with sand. Her skin was badly sunburned, deep red along her cheeks and nose, peeling in angry patches that spoke of hours, maybe a full day under direct sun. Her lips were cracked and pale, flecked with dried blood where she had bitten them unconsciously. She wore lightweight field clothes, the fabric torn at the knees and elbows, the color dulled by dust. A battered backpack lay nearby, one strap snapped clean through, its contents half spilled and half buried. Daniel leaned closer, shielding her face briefly with his body as a gust kicked up more sand. Her hair, dark brown and thick, was pulled back into what had once been a practical tie, now loose and tangled, strands plastered to her temples with sweat. She was slim, but not frail. Even in this state, Daniel could see the shape of a body accustomed to work rather than comfort lean muscle along her arms, shoulders that suggested strength rather than softness. This wasn't a tourist who had taken a wrong turn. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck again, steadying his own breathing as he waited. There it was, a pulse, faint but stubborn. Alive. "Hey," Daniel said quietly, unsure if she could hear him. "You're not done yet." Atlas lowered his head slightly, sniffing near her face, then lifted it again, satisfied enough to settle into a sit beside her shoulders, his body acting as a windbreak. The dog's presence was calm but intense, as if he understood that noise and haste would only steal what little strength she had left. Daniel slid his hands under her shoulders and knees, lifting carefully. She weighed less than he expected, the lightness alarming, a sign of dehydration and energy burned away. He carried her back toward the helicopter, each step deliberate, aware of how quickly heat could turn a mistake into something fatal. Atlas walked at his side, occasionally glancing back at the horizon, amber eyes alert for movement. Inside the cabin, Daniel laid her across the rear seat, positioning her on her side to ease breathing, then dug into her pack. He found a cracked canteen with only a mouthful of water left and a folded map creased so many times it looked like cloth. There was a GPS unit, too, its screen shattered, useless. Daniel cursed under his breath, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the weary irritation of someone who had seen plans fail before. He wet his fingers and touched them gently to her lips, letting a few drops fall. Her mouth twitched. She swallowed reflexively, a small sound escaping her throat. Atlas settled on the floor near her legs, his broad body blocking the sun streaming through the open door, eyes fixed on her face. When she stirred, it was subtle at first, a tightening around the eyes, a shallow breath turning uneven. Daniel leaned in. "Easy," he said. "You're safe. Don't try to move." Her eyes opened briefly, unfocused, hazel flecked with green, struggling to anchor themselves in reality. She looked older than she probably was, exhaustion carving lines that didn't belong there yet. Her gaze flicked to Atlas, widening slightly, then back to Daniel. Confusion passed, followed by a fragile flicker of relief. "The letters," she whispered, voice so dry it barely carried. "I saw them," Daniel replied. "They worked." That seemed to steady her. Her brow furrowed as if she were trying to hold on to consciousness by force of will. "Didn't know if anyone would fly this far out." Daniel's jaw tightened. Neither did he. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his tone level. "Sarah," she breathed after a moment. "Sarah Collins." The name hung in the air, suddenly real. Sarah Collins looked like someone who had once been meticulous, her features fine-boned, her nose straight, her brows dark and expressive beneath the sunburn. She had the look of a woman who paid attention to details, even now trying to catalog what she saw despite the fog in her mind. Daniel guessed early 30s. Her accent, faint but noticeable, suggested Midwest rather than coastal. She tried to push herself up and failed, a soft sound of frustration escaping her. Daniel placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Don't," he said. "You're severely dehydrated. You'll pass out again if you fight it." She let out a weak huff that might have been a laugh under better circumstances. "Figures," she murmured. Atlas shifted closer, his muzzle brushing her calf, a grounding presence. She glanced down at him and managed the faintest smile. "Good dog," she whispered, then closed her eyes as if the effort had cost her more than she could afford. Daniel straightened and closed the helicopter door, sealing them briefly in shade. He climbed back into the pilot seat, hands moving automatically through the checklist, but his mind was no longer quiet. Sarah Collins. A name meant a story, and stories meant complications. He lifted off slowly, careful not to jostle her, and angled the helicopter toward the distant mountains where a small service outpost sat, a place with a radio strong enough to reach help. As they climbed, Daniel glanced back once more. Sarah's breathing had steadied slightly, her chest rising and falling with shallow rhythm. Atlas lay beside her now, chin resting on the floor, eyes half-lidded but alert, tracking every movement she made. Daniel felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle in fully. He had landed. He had crossed the line. Whatever Sarah Collins had been running from, whatever had driven her to carve SOS into the sand with failing hands, it wasn't finished with her yet. And by choosing to land, Daniel had stepped back into a world that didn't care about rituals or distance. The desert fell away beneath them, the scarred letters shrinking until they were nothing but disturbed sand once more. Daniel kept flying, the heat still pressing, the future suddenly louder than the past. The helicopter climbed steadily, its shadow shrinking beneath it as the desert spread outward in ruthless calm, and inside the cabin the heat softened just enough to let breath come easier. Daniel Brooks kept one hand firm on the controls while the other rested loosely near the console, not because the machine required it, but because stillness felt unfamiliar now. Behind him, the woman stirred again, a deeper movement this time, as if consciousness were no longer drifting in and out, but gathering itself with intent. Atlas lifted his head immediately, ears tilting forward, amber eyes alert yet calm, tracking her with the quiet seriousness of a sentry who had accepted a new responsibility. Daniel glanced back, measuring her breathing, the faint color returning to her lips, where water had touched skin cracked by the sun. "Easy," he said again, voice low and even. "You're stable. Don't rush it." The woman swallowed, eyes fluttering open, and this time they stayed open. She looked around slowly, cataloging the interior of the helicopter, the worn seats, the scuffed metal floor, the instrument panel dulled by age but meticulously maintained. Her gaze lingered on Daniel last, assessing him with a practiced focus that cut through her weakness. She was in her mid-30s, he guessed more confidently now, with a narrow face framed by dark brown hair that fell past her shoulders when clean, but now clung to her skin in sweat-stiffened strands. Her complexion was naturally fair, though now burned a deep, painful red, freckles barely visible beneath the damage. There was an intelligence in her eyes that exhaustion had not erased, sharp and searching, paired with a restraint that suggested she had learned when to speak and when not to. She shifted carefully, wincing, then let her head rest back. "Emily Carter," she said, voice hoarse but steadier than before. "Geological survey engineer." Daniel nodded once, committing the name to memory. Emily Carter didn't look like someone prone to panic. Even now, stripped down to bare survival, she carried herself with an internal order, as if part of her mind were still working through checklists despite the state of her body. Her hands, when she lifted one weakly to adjust her position, were calloused in a way that spoke of field work rather than office comfort, fingers strong and precise despite the tremor of dehydration. Atlas shifted closer, his broad frame blocking the sun that cut through the window, and Emily noticed him properly for the first time. Her eyes softened, and she let out a breath that might have been relief or disbelief. "You found me," she murmured, more statement than question. "He did," Daniel replied, nodding toward the dog. Emily's lips curved faintly. "Figures," she whispered. "I kept thinking, if anyone sees it, it won't be a person. It'll be instinct." Daniel didn't respond. He had learned long ago that people revealed more when silence was allowed to settle. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again with visible effort. "I didn't wander out there," she said quietly, as if correcting an assumption that hadn't been voiced. "I was part of a survey team, 6 of us, contracted to map subsurface anomalies, gravitational inconsistencies, mineral density shifts. It was supposed to be boring." Her mouth twitched, humorless. "It wasn't." Daniel adjusted the heading slightly, keeping the helicopter smooth. "What did you find?" he asked. Emily exhaled slowly. "An illegal extraction site. Not amateur, organized, deep drilling where there shouldn't have been any permits. Rare earths, maybe more. Someone had invested serious money." As she spoke, the composure she had been holding together began to fracture at the edges, not into hysteria, but into something heavier, anger sharpened by fear. "We logged it, tagged coordinates, sent a preliminary report." "Oh." "That's when they came." Her fingers curled against the seatbelt unconsciously. 3 vehicles, no plates. Men with weapons, not military issue but not sloppy either. They knew exactly what to destroy first: our comms, our vehicles. They took my colleagues, tied them, blindfolded them. I tried to run when the shooting started. Her voice dropped, thickening. "I didn't get far. I fell, hit my head. When I woke up it was dark and quiet, and I was alone." Atlas let out a low sound at the edge of hearing, not a growl but something deeper, and Emily glanced at him again. "They thought I was dead," she continued, "or not worth the trouble. I don't know which is worse." Daniel felt a familiar chill creep along his spine. This was no accident, no random cruelty. This was systematic. He kept his tone neutral. "How long were you out there?" Emily swallowed. "I lost track. I walked until the sun came up again. I rationed water until there was nothing left to ration. When I couldn't walk anymore, I crawled." She paused, eyes closing briefly as memory pressed in. "The SOS. It was the last thing I had. I wrote it knowing the wind would erase it. I just needed something that said I'd tried." The words settled heavily in the cabin. Daniel had seen that kind of resolve before, the decision to act not because it would save you, but because not acting would mean surrendering the last piece of yourself. He glanced back at her again. "You did more than try," he said. Emily opened her eyes, meeting his gaze, and for a second the exhaustion gave way to something raw and unguarded. "They'll come back," she said. "If they realize I'm missing." Daniel didn't argue. He didn't reassure her with false certainty. Instead, he checked the fuel gauge, then the radio. Static answered him, thick and stubborn. The desert below was infamous for dead zones, and this stretch was one of the worst. "We're heading for a service outpost," he said. "Old, but it has a relay strong enough to reach help." Emily nodded faintly. "They'll be watching the roads," she said. "They won't expect the air." Daniel's jaw tightened. That was true for now. Atlas shifted again, settling more firmly beside Emily, his head resting near her knee. She reached down instinctively, her fingers brushing his fur, and he accepted the contact without hesitation, eyes never leaving her face. There was something in that small exchange that tightened Daniel's chest unexpectedly. He had lived so long without witnesses that seeing another human allowed into Atlas's circle felt like a quiet concession to fate. Emily seemed to sense it. "He doesn't trust easily," she said softly. Daniel huffed a breath that might have been agreement. "Neither do I." Emily's eyes flicked back to him, studying the lines at the corners of his eyes, the disciplined stillness of his posture. "You military?" she asked. Daniel hesitated only a fraction. "Former," he said. She nodded, understanding without prying. There was a particular way professionals recognized one another, a language of restraint and observation. "I'm sorry," Emily said after a moment, "for dragging you into this." Daniel shook his head. "You didn't," he replied. "I chose to land." The words surprised him with their weight. He hadn't framed it that way in his own mind yet, but it was true. He had chosen to break the ritual. Emily let out a slow breath. "Then I'm glad you did." Outside, the desert rolled on, indifferent to confessions and choices alike. The helicopter pushed forward, a lone mechanical insect crossing a landscape that erased footprints without apology. Daniel felt the old tension in his shoulders shift, not easing, but reconfiguring. This was a different kind of burden than the ones he'd been carrying alone. It involved another life, other lives still unaccounted for. It involved consequences. Emily's eyes began to droop again, her body giving into exhaustion now that immediate danger had passed. "Sleep," Daniel said gently. "I'll wake you when we're close." She nodded, fighting it for a second, then letting go. Atlas adjusted his position, pressing closer to her side, his breathing slow and steady, an anchor in motion. Daniel focused on the horizon ahead, where a line of mountains cut sharply against the sky. Somewhere beyond them was a radio tower, a chance at help, and a path that led away from the isolation he had so carefully built. He didn't know yet how far this would go or what it would cost him. He only knew that the SOS on the sand had not been just a message for rescue. It had been a turning point, and now, with Emily Carter breathing behind him and Atlas standing guard, there was no pretending otherwise. The radio answered Daniel Brooks with nothing but a coarse hiss, a dry rasp that swallowed his call signs and returned them as meaningless noise, and he shut it off with a controlled flick of his thumb, rather than waste fuel or patience on hope that refused to listen. The helicopter continued forward at low altitude, skimming the heat-smeared air where distance bent and shimmered, and the desert below no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. Atlas stood braced between the seats, forepaws planted wide, nose angled toward the horizon with an insistence that tightened Daniel's shoulders. The dog's posture was precise, not agitated ears forward, tail low, muscles coiled, an alertness born from years of work rather than fear. Daniel trusted that stance more than any instrument on the panel. Behind him, Emily Carter slept fitfully, her breathing shallow but steady, one hand curled loosely near her chest as if holding on to something invisible. The color had not returned to her skin yet. The sunburn still glared raw across her cheeks and nose, and her hair clung in dark strands to the curve of her neck. Daniel adjusted their course by degrees, angling toward a shallow basin where the land dipped and rose again, a place the maps labeled blandly, but pilots knew as a corridor for anything that didn't want to be seen. Atlas's head tracked the shift instantly. "You see it too," Daniel murmured, not expecting an answer. The dog did not look at him. The first sign came as a disturbance in the far distance, a faint plume lifting from the horizon like smoke that had learned to crawl rather than rise. Daniel leaned forward, squinting through the glare. Dust. Not the broad, wandering haze of wind, but a narrow ribbon that held its shape, moving with purpose. Vehicles. Plural. He banked slightly, lowering again, and the desert responded by revealing itself in fragments, a long scar of parallel lines cut into the sand, too crisp to be old, too straight to be natural. Tire tracks. Fresh. Emily had been right. They hadn't abandoned her. They had assumed the desert would finish the job. Daniel's jaw set as he followed the lines, careful to keep the helicopter's shadow off them, mindful of how sound carried in heat. Atlas let out a single low breath through his nose, not a growl, a note of confirmation. Daniel felt the old calculations rise without permission: fuel versus distance, altitude versus exposure, speed versus noise. And he hated how familiar it all felt. He glanced back once. Emily had shifted, eyes open now, watching him with a clarity that cut through fatigue. "They're moving," she said, reading his posture rather than the view. Her voice was steadier than before, the engineer's mind pushing past pain to pattern recognition. Daniel nodded. "At least two," he said, "maybe three." Emily swallowed, then angled her head to the side window, following the faint dust ribbon with narrowed eyes. "They won't go straight back," she said. "They'll loop. Check their perimeter." Daniel appreciated the way she framed it. Not panic, not speculation, but method. "Why?" he asked. "Because they're disciplined," she replied. "Not scavengers. Whoever runs this doesn't like loose ends." Atlas shifted his weight, nose dipping, then lifting again as if sampling layers of the air. The dog's coat charcoal along the spine, fading to steel gray at the ribs, caught the light in dull waves, and Daniel noticed the faint nick along Atlas's left ear, a souvenir from a training accident years ago, the kind that left no fear behind, only memory. The helicopter crossed the tracks at an angle, and Daniel caught the glint of metal ahead, something half buried, reflecting sunlight in a way that refused to be ignored. He slowed, hovering just enough to see it clearly. A broken antenna mast, snapped clean, its base twisted as if by force rather than wear. Emily exhaled. "Our truck," she said, "or what's left of it." Daniel set them down behind a low rise, the skids sinking into sand that felt like ash. The engine wound down reluctantly, and silence rushed in, thick and heavy, pressing against ears and skin. Heat surged. Atlas was out first, circling once with his nose low, then returning to Emily's side, standing between her and the open desert as if the concept of retreat did not apply to him. Daniel crouched, running his fingers through the sand near the tracks. The edges were sharp, hours old at most. He followed them with his eyes until they vanished into a series of shallow gullies cut by ancient water. "They're heading for cover," he said. Emily nodded. "There's an old access road beyond that ridge," she replied, "barely marked. It won't show on civilian maps." Daniel studied her face. Despite the pain etched into her features, There was a steadiness there that came from competence rather than bravado. She had not broken in the desert. She had adapted. Atlas's head snapped up suddenly, ears pinning forward, body stiffening. Daniel froze. The sound came a moment later, carried thinly on the heat, a distant engine note, low and uneven, the kind of growl that belonged to modified diesel rather than stock vehicles. It cut out, then returned, closer. Daniel's mind moved quickly. He could lift off now, draw their attention, risk pursuit in open air. Or he could stay low, let the desert swallow them again. He chose neither. He chose patience. He guided Emily back into the helicopter's shadow and motioned for Atlas to lie down. The dog obeyed instantly, flattening himself into the sand as if he were part of it, eyes never leaving the ridgeline. The engine noise grew louder, then resolved into two vehicles cresting the rise, a pair of off-road trucks, matte black, dust-caked, riding high on reinforced suspension. They moved with spacing that suggested planning rather than chance, one leading, one trailing, scanning opposite arcs. Daniel watched through a gap, cataloging details the way he had been trained to do: the roll cages, the reinforced bumpers, the lack of markings. The lead truck stopped briefly, a man stepping out to survey the tracks. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a build that read as functional rather than ornamental, his movements economical. He wore a cap pulled low and a beard trimmed close to the jaw, dark hair showing gray at the temples. Even at a distance, Daniel recognized the posture, the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The man knelt, ran a gloved hand along the sand, then stood, signaling with two fingers. The truck split. "They know," Emily whispered, her voice tight but controlled. "They're sweeping." Daniel nodded once. He felt the old anger rise, cold and precise. He had left this life for a reason, but life, apparently, had not left him. Atlas's muscles trembled with restrained energy, and Daniel rested a hand on the dog's shoulders, grounding both of them. He reached for the radio again, adjusted frequency, power, antenna angle, static, then faint, broken a voice that almost wasn't there. "Service North relay." Daniel leaned in, repeating coordinates with clipped precision. The response did not come, but the attempt mattered. He shut it down and turned to Emily. "We move," he said. "On foot, short distance. There's a wash east of here that'll hide heat signatures." Emily frowned. "You know this terrain," she said. It wasn't a question. Daniel gave a humorless huff. "Enough." They moved quickly but carefully, using the helicopter's bulk as cover until the ridge swallowed them. The wash was narrow, its sides carved smooth by water that no longer came, and it smelled faintly of minerals and old damp. Atlas took point, nose low, paws placing with deliberate softness, despite the heat. Emily followed, favoring one knee where the skin had split, grit ground into the wound. Daniel adjusted his pace to match hers without comment. Above them, engines revved, then faded, the truck circling wider. The desert did not echo the way mountains did. It absorbed sound, held it close, made it feel intimate. Daniel felt watched even when he could see nothing. At a bend in the wash, they came upon something else. A temporary marker, a strip of survey tape tied low to a rock, its fluorescent color dulled by dust. Emily's eyes hardened. "They took my team this way," she said, "recently." Daniel studied the ground. More tracks, lighter this time, boot prints, different tread patterns, more people than vehicles. "They're not far," he said. Atlas stopped abruptly, lifting his head, nostrils flaring. Daniel followed his gaze to the ridge above. A glint, brief, then gone. A lens, binoculars or scope. The man with the beard was thorough. Daniel weighed options with ruthless clarity. He could break contact now, retreat deeper, wait for night, or he could do something else, something that would pull attention where he wanted it. He looked back toward the helicopter's position, then at Emily. She read his face and shook her head. "Don't," she said. "They'll shoot it out of the sky." Daniel's lips pressed thin. "They'll try," he said, But they'll be wrong. Atlas shifted, sensing the decision before it was spoken. Daniel turned them back toward the wash's mouth, moving faster now, counting breaths, counting steps. When they reached the rise that overlooked the helicopter, Daniel paused, scanning. The trucks were closer, engines idling, men spreading. He moved without hesitation, sprinting for the helicopter, Atlas a gray shadow at his side. He vaulted into the seat, powered up, blades biting air with a violence that threw sand and dust skyward. The trucks reacted instantly, engines roaring, men scrambling. Daniel lifted just enough to be seen, then veered hard west, low and fast, dragging a plume of dust like a challenge. He did not wait to see if they followed. He knew they would. He flew toward a maze of gullies where vehicles would struggle and sight lines would fracture. Behind him, Atlas braced, eyes bright, alive with purpose. Somewhere below, Emily watched the desert rearrange itself into threat and opportunity. Daniel felt the familiar calm settle, not peace, not joy, but clarity. The desert was not silent. It was speaking, and for the first time in years, he was listening. The desert folded inward as Daniel Brooks guided the helicopter down miles away from the tracks, choosing a dry basin where wind had scoured the land flat and left nothing tall enough to cast a betraying shadow. He cut the engine early and let the skid settle with minimal dust, listening as the world rushed back in, heat ticking against metal, the faint hiss of sand sliding over itself, the quiet that only pretended to be empty. Atlas leapt down first, landing without sound, shoulders squared, nose lifting as if the air itself had weight. The dog's fur along his spine bristled, a subtle ridge of charcoal and steel gray rising with purpose. Daniel followed, crouching instinctively, scanning the horizon before turning to Emily Carter. She moved slower now, pain reasserting itself in her knee and shoulders, but her posture remained deliberate, spine straight, eyes alert. Emily looked different outside the helicopter's shade, her skin raw and peeling, freckles ghosted beneath sunburn, lips cracked despite water. But there was a steadiness to her that heat could not melt. She adjusted the strap of a borrowed pack and nodded once. "It's close," she said quietly. "The ground changes here." Daniel studied the sand. She was right. The surface ahead was disturbed in patterns that didn't belong to wind-low mounds, shallow depressions arranged with intention, as if the desert had been stitched and restitched by careless hands. Atlas padded forward, pausing at intervals to test the air, then stopping completely, head angled toward a low ridge. Daniel followed the dog's line of sight and saw it, a faint shimmer where heat bent around metal, half buried beneath sand. They advanced carefully, using the land's folds for cover, and the camp revealed itself in pieces rather than a whole. A generator sat sunk to its midpoint, vents masked by a crude windbreak of scrap. Thick cables disappeared into the ground like veins. Beyond it, a pair of shipping containers lay staggered and rusted, their doors sealed with fresh welds, sand piled high against their bases to disguise the seams. The smell hit Daniel next diesel, hot oil, and something sharper beneath it, the metallic tang of fear that clung to places where people were kept against their will. Atlas stiffened, a low, controlled growl vibrating through his chest, barely audible. Daniel rested a hand on the dog's shoulders, feeling the tension coil there, ready but obedient. Emily's jaw tightened as she listened. Voices drifted across the camp, muffled by wind and distance. "Told you the girl was dead," one said, careless, bored. Another replied, sharper, "Then why are we still watching the perimeter?" A third voice cut in, calm and authoritative. "Because assumptions get people buried." Daniel recognized the cadence even before he saw the man. He lay prone and inched forward until the ridge gave him a clear view. The speaker stood near the generator, tall and broad, the same bearded figure from earlier, his cap pulled low, sunglasses reflecting the sun. His beard was trimmed with discipline rather than vanity, jaw angular beneath it, and the way he held himself weight-balanced, Hands free-marked him as someone who had learned to survive by thinking first and acting only when necessary. The others deferred to him without question. Daniel felt the old clarity settle in, cold and precise. Emily leaned close, whispering, "That's him. He wasn't at the site before. He came after." The implication hung heavy. Reinforcement. Atlas's ears flicked, and he eased forward on his belly inch by inch, the dog's training evident in every movement. Daniel followed, counting steps, measuring sight lines. He heard it then, faint but unmistakable, a cough, suppressed, from beneath the sand. He froze. Emily heard it too. Her breath caught, then steadied as resolve took over. "They're alive," she whispered. "At least two." Daniel's eyes traced the cables to a section of ground where sand had been compacted into a rough square, a hidden access. He mapped the camp in his head. Generator, containers, access point, guards rotating in predictable arcs. The desert might hide a camp, but it could not erase patterns. He watched as a younger man crossed the space, thin and sharp-featured, his movements jittery, eyes darting. He looked out of place, late 20s maybe, hair cropped too short, skin pale under dust, the kind of man who hadn't chosen this life so much as fallen into it. He kicked at the sand impatiently, muttering, and the bearded leader shot him a glance that snapped him silent. Emily murmured, "They're nervous." Daniel nodded. "Good." A sudden burst of laughter carried across the camp, brittle and forced. "The engineer girl's probably dust by now," someone said. Daniel felt Emily tense beside him, felt Atlas's growl deepen a fraction. The leader raised a hand, silencing them. "We don't count bodies we haven't seen," he said evenly. "And we don't get sloppy." He turned, scanning the ridgeline, and Daniel flattened himself further, heart steady, breathing slow. The leader's gaze passed over them, then moved on. "They're moving something tonight," Emily whispered after a moment. "That container. They'll need power." Daniel followed her look. One container bore newer rust patterns around its edges, as if it had been opened recently. He imagined the space inside, dark, hot, air recycled through a fan that might stop at any moment. He imagined people counting breaths. Daniel drew back slowly, motioning Atlas to retreat with him. They slid into the gully where shadows pooled. Daniel crouched, drawing lines in the sand with a finger, mapping routes. "We can't hit this head-on," he said quietly. "Too many eyes." Emily nodded. "The generator," she replied. "Everything depends on it." Daniel considered. Cutting power would draw attention, but it would also open doors. Atlas shifted, eyes bright, understanding the shape of the problem, if not its words. Daniel looked at Emily, really looked at the way she held pain at bay with stubborn discipline, at the fine tremor in her hands she refused to acknowledge. "If this goes wrong," he said, "you run, east, don't stop." Emily met his gaze, chin lifting. "If this goes wrong," she said, "they die." It wasn't defiance, it was fact. Daniel accepted it with a nod. He moved. Using the generator's noise as cover, he crept closer, timing his steps to the thrum of the engine. Atlas stayed with Emily, low and still, a promise rather than a threat. Daniel reached the generator's shadow and slipped behind it, heat washing over him. He found the main line, quickly thick cable, poorly shielded. He waited for a guard to pass, then cut it clean with a practiced motion. The engine sputtered, coughed, then died. Darkness fell across the camp like a held breath. Shouts erupted immediately. "Power!" "What happened?" The leader's voice cut through, calm but edged now. "Perimeter." Daniel was already moving back, heart rate rising but controlled. Atlas surged forward at his silent signal, a gray streak that crossed open sand and vanished behind a container. The camp dissolved into chaos, men running, lights flashing on and off, curses thrown into the wind. From beneath the sand came a muffled pounding. Emily ran. She reached the access point and tore at the sand with her hands, heedless of pain, uncovering a steel hatch warm to the touch. She wrenched it open, and heat poured out like breath. Inside, two figures blinked up at her, one older man with a shaved head and a bruised eye, his build thick and compact, the look of someone who had survived worse. The other younger, lean, face streaked with grime, eyes wide with shock and hope. "Emily," the older man rasped. "You're alive." She nodded, voice breaking despite herself. "So are you." Gunfire cracked. Daniel returned fire sparingly, forcing heads down without wasting rounds. Atlas reappeared at his side, teeth bared now, a low snarl vibrating the air. The bearded leader emerged from behind a container, weapon raised, eyes locking with Daniel's across the chaos. Recognition flared there, two men measuring one another not as enemies, but as problems to be solved. The leader gestured, and men shifted to flank. Daniel felt the window narrowing. He shouted over the din, "Now!" Emily hauled the prisoners up and pushed them toward the gully. Daniel covered their retreat, then fell back himself, Atlas guarding their rear with lethal restraint. They reached the gully as headlights flared behind them, engines roaring back to life as backup generators kicked in. The desert swallowed them again, shadows closing, but the camp remained alive behind them, angry and wounded. Daniel knew the truth then. This was no longer a rescue. It was a pursuit. And the desert, patient and vast, had just chosen sides. The desert night had not yet arrived, but the light was already changing, stretching shadows into long, deceptive shapes as Daniel Brooks moved with the economy of someone who understood how sound and motion betrayed intention. The chaos from the power cut still rippled through the hidden camp, voices overlapping, boots scraping sand, flashlights jerking like nervous thoughts. Daniel slipped along the lee side of a container, shoulders squared, breath controlled, every step placed where the wind would swallow it. Atlas moved ahead of him, not rushing, not hesitating, the German shepherd's body low and fluid, gray-black coat blending into the dust-shadowed ground. The dog's age showed only in the faint silvering around his muzzle. Otherwise, he looked carved for this moment. 6 years old, powerful without bulk, eyes bright with purpose rather than excitement. Atlas paused, ears flicking once, then twice. Daniel followed the cue and froze. A guard stood near the generator housing, his back turned, attention fixed on the darkened control panel. He was a man in his early 30s, average height, narrow shoulders, hunched from fatigue rather than caution, his uniform mismatched and stained with oil. His beard was patchy, grown more from neglect than choice, and his movements lacked the discipline of the others. A hired body, not a believer. Daniel closed the distance in 3 silent steps, locking an arm around the man's neck and dropping his weight with practiced precision. The guard struggled briefly, more surprised than defiant, then sagged as consciousness slipped away. Daniel eased him down, bound his wrists with a strip torn from the man's own sling, and dragged him into deeper shadow. No wasted motion, no cruelty. Atlas watched, head tilted slightly, accepting the outcome without sound. Daniel retrieved the old radio he had spotted earlier, a squat, dented unit bolted to a crate near the container. Its casing was scratched, the antenna bent, but it hummed faintly with residual power. He knelt, shielding it with his body, and turned the dial slowly. Static surged, then thinned. "Mayday," he whispered, voice measured. "Civilian aircraft and multiple hostages at coordinates." He rattled them off from memory, precise to the second, then repeated them once more. "Armed group, illegal extraction site, survivors confirmed." The signal warbled, threatened to vanish, then caught briefly, long enough for Daniel to hear a clipped acknowledgement before the channel dissolved into noise again. It was enough. It had to be. Atlas shifted, nose lifting sharply, and Daniel followed the dog's gaze to a section of sand that looked wrong, too smooth, too deliberately tamped. Beneath it lay the steel hatch Emily had described, the access to the underground holding space. Daniel motioned, and Atlas moved first, pawing gently at the sand, clearing it without sound until metal gleamed dully beneath the fading light. From below came the unmistakable sound of human presence, a cough, a whispered curse, the scrape of movement against restraint. Daniel's jaw tightened. He knelt and worked the latch, muscles straining as the heat radiated up from the buried steel. It opened with a reluctant groan, and hot, stale air rushed out, carrying the sour smell of sweat and fear. Inside, the space was cramped, barely tall enough to kneel, its walls lined with rough supports and cables. 3 figures stared up at him, eyes wide. The first was a man in his late 40s, stocky and broad through the chest despite days of confinement, his head shaved close, jaw square and bruised. His skin was darkened by sun and grime, but his gaze was steady, assessing rather than pleading. Beside him crouched a younger man, early 20s, tall and thin, his limbs all angles, hair sandy blonde and plastered to his forehead, freckles standing out starkly against dirt-streaked skin. The third was a woman, mid-30s, compact and wiry, her black hair cut short and uneven, as if hacked away in desperation, her eyes sharp despite exhaustion. "Emily?" the stocky man rasped. "She's alive," Daniel said. "And so are you, if we move." Atlas dropped into the opening with surprising grace, landing lightly and positioning himself between the prisoners and the ladder, his presence both shield and command. The woman exhaled a shaky breath that might have been laughter. "Good dog," she whispered, then winced as she shifted. Daniel cut their restraints quickly, hands sure, and ushered them up one by one. The younger man stumbled, legs numb, and Daniel caught his elbow, steadying him without comment. Above ground, the camp was tightening, voices sharpening into orders. "Find the hatch!" someone shouted. "They're here!" Emily appeared at Daniel's side then, her face drawn but determined, dark hair pulled back with shaking hands. She met the eyes of the freed engineers, relief breaking through her control for just a moment before she reined it in. "Move," she said. "Stay low." Gunfire cracked from the far end of the camp, not aimed yet, but testing. Daniel felt the moment compress. Then Vince Harper stepped into view. He emerged from behind a container with the ease of someone who believed the ground belonged to him, tall and lean, his beard neatly trimmed, gray threading through dark hair at the temples. His face was angular, cheekbones sharp, nose slightly bent from an old break, eyes pale and cold beneath the brim of his cap. He wore his weapon like an extension of his arm, pistol held low but ready, finger resting with intimate familiarity on the trigger guard. The camp quieted around him instinctively. Vince Harper did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "That's far enough," he said calmly, aiming the pistol at Daniel's chest. "You're out of options." Daniel stepped forward, placing himself fully between Harper and the others, his hands visible, posture relaxed in a way that read as confidence rather than surrender. Atlas stood at his side, muscles drawn tight, ears pinned, eyes locked on Harper's knees. Emily's breath caught behind Daniel, and he felt rather than saw her tension. "You should have stayed in the air," Harper continued, tone almost conversational. "People who wander into things they don't understand don't last long out here." Daniel met his gaze, unblinking. He had seen men like Harper before, men whose calm came not from peace, but from certainty that they could end lives without consequence. "You left witnesses," Daniel said. "That's a mistake." Harper's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Witnesses disappear." He raised the gun a fraction higher. Time narrowed. Daniel's hand did not move. His voice did. "Atlas." The command was quiet, almost gentle. The dog responded with explosive precision. Atlas launched himself forward, not at Harper's throat, not at his face, but low and hard into the man's right knee. The impact was a wet, bone-deep crack that echoed louder than the gunshot that followed. Harper screamed, the sound raw and involuntary, as his leg buckled and he pitched sideways. The pistol fired wild, the round tearing into sand instead of flesh, and Atlas twisted away instantly, teeth bared now, stance wide, ready to strike again if needed. Daniel closed the distance in 2 strides, driving Harper's wrist into the ground and kicking the pistol out of reach. He pinned the man with controlled force, knee across Harper's shoulder, forearm locking his neck just enough to immobilize without cutting air. Harper thrashed once, then stilled, breath coming in ragged bursts, pain carving lines into his composed mask. "You're done," Daniel said evenly. Around them, the camp erupted into chaos shouts, boots pounding, flashlights swinging, but hesitation rippled through the men nearest, shock breaking their rhythm. Emily shouted, "Go!" and the freed engineers bolted toward the gully, Atlas pivoting to cover their retreat, his body a living barrier, eyes blazing. Daniel hauled Harper's arms behind his back and bound them with a zip tie ripped from a crate, cinching it tight. Harper spat sand and blood, eyes burning with hatred. "You think this ends it?" he snarled. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. He dragged Harper a few feet into cover and left him there, disarmed and screaming orders no one had time to follow. The radio crackled suddenly, louder now, clearer. "Unidentified station, repeat coordinates," a voice demanded. Daniel snatched it up. "Coordinates unchanged," he said. "Multiple civilians freed. Armed resistance ongoing." "Copy," came the reply, crisp and real. "Assets inbound." Relief did not come, not yet. Atlas barked once, sharp and commanding, then broke into a run, leading the group toward the wash. Daniel fell in behind them, firing once to keep heads down, then conserving ammunition. The desert swallowed them again, the gully's walls closing around their flight. Behind them, engines roared and curses followed, but the pursuit fractured, disoriented by injury and sudden resistance. They ran until lungs burned and muscles screamed, then slowed only when the sound faded into distance. Daniel halted them beneath an overhang where shadow pooled thick and cool. The engineers collapsed, gasping. The stocky man leaned against the rock, eyes closed, jaw set in gratitude he did not yet have words for. The younger man laughed softly, half hysterical, half awed. The woman with the short black hair rested her forehead against the stone, shoulders shaking. Emily sank to her knees, hands pressed into sand, the weight of survival crashing over her at last. Atlas stood watch at the mouth of the wash, silhouette sharp against the dying light, chest rising and falling steadily. Daniel checked the horizon, then the radio again. This time the response came without effort. He exhaled slowly, a sound that carried years with it. The desert was still dangerous, the camp was not finished. But people who had been buried were breathing free air again. And one dog, answering a single word, had tipped the balance. The Federal Rescue Helicopter arrived like a promise that refused to be quiet, its rotors slicing the desert air with a sound too purposeful to be mistaken for chance. Daniel Brooks saw it crest the ridge long before it reached them, the aircraft painted in sun-bleached white and orange, unmistakable against the deepening gold of late afternoon. The desert answered its arrival by rising in spirals of dust and light, and for the first time since Daniel had chosen to land near those carved letters in the sand, he allowed himself to believe the worst of it was over. Atlas stood beside him, ears high, posture alert, but no longer coiled to strike, watching the helicopter descend with calm curiosity rather than suspicion. The dog's work was finished. Now he waited. Emily Carter was helped forward by two of the freed engineers, her steps unsteady but determined. She looked different already, not healed, not whole, but no longer hollowed out by desperation. The color in her face remained uneven, sunburn still angry across her skin, yet her eyes were clear, focused, the way they must have been before the desert stripped everything down to survival. Her dark hair had been tied back with a strip of cloth, practical and plain, exposing a face marked by fatigue and quiet resilience. She paused as the rescue team reached them. The first medic to step out was a woman in her early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, her hair pulled into a tight braid beneath her helmet. Her movements were efficient, confident, the kind that came from years of triage under pressure. She took Emily's arm, speaking in a low, steady voice, already assessing injuries without dramatizing them. Behind her came two federal agents, both men, both built like the desert itself, lean, weathered, faces cut with sharp lines and eyes that missed very little. One had a gray beard trimmed close to his jaw, The other, clean-shaven with a scar that ran from the corner of his mouth toward his ear, a reminder of some past lesson learned the hard way. They surveyed the scene with controlled attention, taking in Daniel, Atlas, the rescued engineers, the distant plume of dust where the camp still simmered in anger. Questions would come later. For now, survival took priority. The engineers were loaded first, each guided with care, but no ceremony. The stocky man with the shaved head clasped Daniel's forearm before climbing aboard, his grip strong despite exhaustion. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The younger engineer, freckles stark against dirt-streaked skin, hesitated at the threshold and glanced back at Atlas, disbelief and gratitude mixing on his face. "I owe him," he said quietly. Daniel shook his head once. "You owe yourself," he replied. The woman with the uneven black hair was last among them, pausing long enough to meet Emily's eyes. There was something unspoken there, a shared understanding of fear endured and survived that passed between them before she climbed aboard. The medic waited patiently, sensing that this moment mattered more than protocol. Emily turned to Daniel, really turned, her gaze steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I wouldn't be standing here if you hadn't landed," she said. Her voice wavered once, then steadied again. Most people wouldn't have. Daniel looked past her for a second, toward the desert stretching endlessly behind them, toward the faint outline of the wash where Atlas had led them, toward the buried camp that would soon no longer be secret. "Most people didn't see it," he said. Emily followed his gaze, then looked down at the sand beneath her boots. The light was shifting now, the sun sinking lower, turning the desert from harsh white gold to something softer, almost forgiving. She walked a few steps away from the helicopter, ignoring the medic's raised brow, and stopped where the ground flattened. There, barely visible now, were the remnants of the letters. The wind had already begun its work. The edges were blurred, the line shallow, the message fading back into anonymity. SOS. Emily knelt despite the pain in her legs, pressing her palm briefly into the sand where the first S had been. She closed her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. The words meant not only for Daniel and Atlas, but for the stubborn, desperate version of herself who had carved that plea into the earth with bare hands. When she stood, she wiped her fingers against her pants and faced Daniel again. Atlas had approached quietly, standing at her side, his presence solid and grounding. Emily crouched with effort and rested her forehead briefly against the dog's broad chest. Atlas accepted the gesture without movement, his tail giving a single slow sweep. "You saved more than my life," Emily said, looking up at Daniel. "You saved the truth." Daniel didn't answer immediately. He watched as the rescue team secured their gear, as the agents began marking coordinates and speaking into radios that now worked clearly under the open sky. He watched as the desert, which had hidden so much, finally began to give things back. "Take care of yourself," he said at last. Emily nodded. "You too." The medic guided her toward the helicopter, and Emily climbed aboard, turning once more at the doorway. Her eyes found the horizon, then the fading letters, then Daniel and Atlas standing together in the lengthening shadows. The rotors spun up again, wind surging outward, sand lifting in shimmering arcs. The helicopter rose, carrying Emily and the others toward a future that would not forget what it had almost buried. Silence returned slowly, settling into the space left behind. Daniel stood where he was for a long moment after the rescue aircraft disappeared into the sky, his shoulders finally lowering as the tension bled out of them. Atlas moved closer, pressing his side against Daniel's leg, a familiar weight that anchored him in the present. They walked back toward Daniel's old helicopter together, the machine waiting patiently where he had left it, battered but loyal. Daniel ran a hand along the fuselage before climbing in, a small, unconscious gesture of gratitude. He started the engine, and the familiar roar filled the air, but it no longer felt like armor. It felt like movement. As the helicopter lifted and turned west, the sun slid closer to the horizon, painting the desert in bands of amber and copper. The letters were nearly gone now, erased by wind and time, but their work was finished. Atlas settled into the seat beside him, turning in a slow circle before lowering himself and resting his head on Daniel's thigh. The weight was comforting, real. Daniel rested a hand on the dog's neck, fingers threading through coarse fur warm from the day. He felt something loosen inside him then, something he hadn't known how to name until it began to release its grip. He had spent years believing that distance could keep the past from finding him, that staying above the world meant staying untouched by it. The desert had proven him wrong. A message carved into sand by desperate hands had reached up and pulled him back into the gravity of other lives. It had demanded that he choose, and in choosing, he had remembered who he was beneath the rituals and the noise. The helicopter flew on into the fading light, carrying a man who no longer mistook isolation for peace, and a dog who had always known the difference. The desert stretched endlessly below, but it no longer felt empty. Somewhere in that vastness, a story had changed direction, not with gunfire or orders, but with 3 uneven letters written by a woman who refused to disappear quietly. And that, Daniel understood as the sun dipped low and the sky softened around him, was what SOS truly meant. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they are written quietly, 3 simple letters carved into sand by hands that refuse to give up. In our everyday lives, we all face deserts of our own, moments of loneliness, fear, exhaustion, or silence where it feels like no one sees us and no help is coming. But Scripture reminds us that God never turns His eyes away. Even when the world feels empty, He is watching, listening, and moving, often through ordinary people, unexpected paths, and faithful hearts that choose compassion over comfort. That SOS in the desert did more than save a life. It became a reminder that God still works through courage, through kindness, and through those who are willing to stop, look down, and answer a call for help. And maybe today, that message is for you. Maybe you are not lost, but someone near you is. Or maybe you are the one quietly asking God to be seen. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment below and type Amen if you believe that miracles still happen, even in silent places. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more stories of faith, courage, and unexpected grace. May God bless you and your family. May He guide you through every desert season, protect those you love, and remind you again and again that you are never alone.